Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Shadow Storyteller. Before we begin tonight's story, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comment section below. Your support means the world to me, and it helps me bring you more late night stories to listen to before you fall asleep. Now, let's dive into tonight's tale. The protest that changed Marcus's life in Washington, D.C. It was a humid afternoon in the middle of June 2020 when Marcus Allen, a 27-year-old history graduate from Howard University, found himself standing among thousands of people gathered along Pennsylvania Avenue, just a short walk away from the White House. The air was thick with chants, raised fists, and the sound of drums echoing through the streets. Some carried handmade cardboard signs. Others held candles or simply stood in silence. The Black Lives Matter protest that day wasn't the first Marcus had ever attended, but something about the atmosphere was different. Washington, D.C. had been tense for weeks. On the previous evening, news channels had shown heavily armed officers marching past Lafayette Square, and Marcus had stayed awake long into the night, watching, wondering if he had the courage to go out the next day. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, he was already in the heart of the protest. Beside him, a middle-aged woman named Claire, who had traveled all the way from Baltimore, held a banner painted with the words "Justice for George Floyd." The crowd surged and swayed as speeches began on a makeshift stage near the National Archives. Marcus felt his heartbeat slow, then quicken, in rhythm with the chanting that seemed to rise and fall like waves crashing against invisible walls. The sky was a pale, cloudless blue, and the sun burned against the pavement, making the air shimmer. People passed water bottles from hand to hand, strangers becoming companions in the heat of the moment. A group of musicians began to play trumpets and drums, filling the air with a rhythm that was both mournful and powerful, as if history itself were being rewritten in those very streets. Marcus noticed the details. How a young boy sat on his father's shoulders waving a small flag. How a woman knelt silently with tears running down her cheeks. How the police line stood rigid in the distance near 15th Street, their shields catching the sunlight. Every detail etched itself into his memory, making him feel that he was not just an observer, but part of something larger, something irreversible. When the chants rose, "No justice, no peace," Marcus shouted until his throat burned. He didn't know if his voice made a difference, but he knew he couldn't stay silent. It wasn't only about Floyd or Breonna Taylor or the countless names painted on signs. It was also about his own story, his family, his community in Southeast D.C. that had carried silent wounds for generations. And yet, amid the intensity, there was also a strange sense of calm. People looked out for one another. Claire pressed a cold water bottle into Marcus's hand when she noticed the sweat pouring down his face. Someone else draped a damp cloth across the neck of an older man who looked faint. It was protest, but it was also unity, a quiet bond that held the crowd together as the afternoon stretched on. Marcus could feel that this day would not leave him unchanged. It was a humid afternoon in the middle of June 2020 when Marcus Allen, a 27-year-old history graduate from Howard University, found himself standing among thousands of people gathered along Pennsylvania Avenue, just a short walk away from the White House. The air was thick with chants, raised fists, and the sound of drums echoing through the streets. Some carried handmade cardboard signs. Others held candles or simply stood in silence. The longer Marcus stayed, the more he felt the protest shaping something inside him. He had marched before, but never in such numbers, never with such intensity in the air. The chants vibrated through his body, each shout reminding him of stories he had read in history books about civil rights marches in the 60s. Yet here he was, not as a reader, but as a participant. Sweat rolled down his temples as he looked around. A group of teenagers ran past him, their faces partly covered with masks. They carried small bottles of water and passed them out to strangers, their movements quick but kind. On the other side of the street, he saw a row of older men and women, some with canes, sitting on folding chairs. Their presence, steady and silent, seemed to lend a deep gravity to the event. Marcus adjusted the strap of his backpack and moved forward, weaving through the crowd. He carried nothing more than a notebook and a pen inside, but somehow that felt like armor to him. He thought, if the world was going to change here, today, he wanted to record it, even if it was just in scribbled sentences no one else might ever read. As the chance of no justice, no peace swelled again, Marcus added his voice. His throat tightened quickly, not used to shouting so loudly, but he pushed through the discomfort. There was something liberating in joining the cry, in letting go of hesitation. At around 2 in the afternoon, Marcus noticed a police line forming closer to the park entrance. The officers stood stiffly, shields at their sides, the heat bouncing off their helmets. For a brief moment, Marcus felt fear prickling at his spine. He had grown up in D.C., he had seen clashes before, and he knew how quickly things could spiral. He glanced at the people beside him, strangers who felt like allies now. A woman in her 60s clasped her rosary, lips moving in prayer. A young man balanced on a stone ledge with a megaphone, urging the crowd to stay peaceful. The tension was heavy, but Marcus didn't move. His legs rooted themselves to ground as if the pavement itself demanded his presence. Suddenly, the chant shifted. The crowd began to kneel. A wave of motion spread backward, and before he realized it, Marcus was lowering himself to ground as well. The hot asphalt burned his knees through his jeans, but he didn't care. Around him, thousands of voices fell into silence. Even the children stopped fussing. The only sound was the faint rustle of fabric and the distant sirens echoing from another street. Minutes passed, though they felt longer. The silence was powerful, heavier than any scream. Marcus closed his eyes and thought about his father, who had often warned him that the world was not equal. He thought about his younger cousin, just 15, who was already nervous around the police. In that silence, Marcus realized he wasn't only kneeling for George Floyd or Breonna Taylor. He was kneeling for his family, for his neighborhood, for himself. When the crowd finally rose again, the energy was different. It was calmer, but stronger, like the quiet determination of people who refused to be broken. A trumpet began to play somewhere near the steps of a building. The music was mournful but beautiful. It carried through the avenue, making Marcus's skin prickle. He had read about such moments in the past, about music uniting movements, but to feel it firsthand was overwhelming. Hours slipped by. The sun tilted westward, painting long shadows across the streets. Volunteers appeared with carts of sandwiches, handing food to anyone who needed it. Marcus accepted one, eating quickly though he hardly felt hungry. He found himself talking with a man named David, a teacher from Arlington, who told him stories about his immigrant students. Another woman, Claire from Baltimore, spoke passionately about her son's future. These conversations wove themselves into Marcus's memory, each voice adding another layer to the day. By late afternoon, tension flared briefly when a plastic bottle was tossed from somewhere deep in the crowd. The object clattered against the pavement far from police, but the officers instantly stiffened, shields rising in unison. Marcus felt panic in his chest. This was how clashes began. Yet, before the fear could spread, people in the front rows raised their hands, shouting peaceful. Peaceful. Their voices drowned out the tension. Slowly, the moment eased. Marcus realized how fragile it all was, balanced between anger and hope. As dusk approached, candles appeared. Tiny flames flickered against the darkening sky. Marcus held one handed to him by a stranger, the wax dripping gently onto his fingers. He stared at the flame, mesmerized. It reminded him of church services from his childhood, the way light symbolized faith. Here, it symbolized something more: unity, resilience, remembrance. When someone began to sing, others joined. The melody spread until the entire crowd was humming or singing softly. The city lights blinked on, casting a golden glow over faces, signs, and flags. For the first time all day, Marcus felt a strange kind of peace. The police line was still there, but they seemed distant, unimportant. What mattered was the people standing beside him, strangers who now felt like part of the story. By the time the crowd began to thin out, it was nearly 10 at night. Marcus's body ached, his throat raw, but his spirit burned with something he couldn't quite name. As he walked toward the metro, the night air cooler now, he thought about how his life had shifted in a single day. He had come uncertain, hesitant, but he was leaving with clarity. The protest hadn't solved everything, but it had changed him, and Marcus knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The protest hadn't solved everything, but it had changed him, and Marcus knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. When he returned to his apartment that night, the city seemed quieter than usual. The faint hum of traffic still drifted through the streets, but after hours of chants and songs, the silence felt almost unreal. He dropped his backpack by the door, peeled off his sweat-soaked shirt, and stood in front of a small mirror above his sink. His face looked different, not in the physical sense, but in the way his eyes seemed sharper, more awake. He touched his cheeks, surprised to find a trace of dried salt from tears he hadn't even realized had fallen during the kneeling silence. He tried to sleep, but the images kept coming back. Claire holding her banner, the police line shimmering in the heat, the little boy waving a flag from his father's shoulders, the sound of the trumpet rising into the evening. Every detail replayed itself in his mind, weaving into something like a personal archive of history. At 3 a.m, he gave up trying to rest. Instead, he opened his notebook and began to write. His hand moved quickly, almost without his control. He wrote about the silence, about the chants, about the fire inside his chest when he realized his voice mattered. The next morning, his phone vibrated non-stop. His cousin from Atlanta had seen him in a short clip circulating on social media, sitting on the ground with thousands of others. His mother called again, her voice heavy with both worry and pride. "I saw the news, Marcus. I don't know if I'm scared or proud, maybe both." He reassured her as best he could, promising again that he would be careful, even though he knew that safety wasn't something anyone could guarantee in times like these. Over the next week, Marcus felt the protest pulling him in deeper. He met with Claire again at a small cafe near U Street. She introduced him to a group of community organizers, teachers, students, and even a lawyer who had been working pro bono for those arrested during the demonstrations. Marcus listened more than he spoke, but when they asked what he could contribute, he surprised himself. "I studied history," he said softly. "I can help connect what's happening now with what's been happening for decades." They welcomed him quickly. Within days, Marcus was helping to organize a workshop at a community center in Anacostia. He spent nights preparing, digging through his old textbooks and lecture notes, scribbling outlines in the margins of his notebook. When the day came, he stood nervously in front of 30 people sitting on plastic chairs, the smell of coffee and disinfectant filling the room. His hand shook at first, but once he began to talk about Reconstruction, about Jim Crow, about the long line of struggles that stretched into the present, his voice steadied. He saw people nodding, some taking notes, others simply listening with intent. Afterward, a teenager approached him. She had short braids and wore a hoodie despite the heat. "I never knew about half the things you just said," she told him. "They don't teach us that at school." "Thank you." Marcus walked home that night with a lightness in his chest. For the first time since graduation, he felt his degree wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a tool, and he had finally found a way to use it. As the summer stretched on, the protests did not stop. Some days there were small gatherings on street corners. Other times they filled entire avenues again. Marcus went to many of them, sometimes holding a sign, sometimes just lending his presence. Each event carried its own energy, sometimes tense, sometimes almost celebratory, but always rooted in the same demand: justice. One evening in July, a clash erupted near 16th Street. Marcus had been handing out water when he heard shouting. The police had moved forward suddenly, shields up, batons raised. People scattered, some tripping over discarded signs, others pulling friends to safety. Marcus ducked behind a lamppost, his heart hammering in his chest. For a moment, he thought he might be arrested or worse. But then, just as quickly, a group of protesters locked arms and began chanting louder, refusing to run. The officers hesitated, then retreated a few steps. Marcus realized in that instant how fragile the balance was, how easily the day could have turned violent. When he returned home, his hands were still trembling. He called his mother, needing to hear her voice. She scolded him gently for putting himself in danger, but beneath her words he could hear the same pride again. "You remind me of your grandfather," she said. "He marched too, back in the 60s. Maybe it's in your blood." That comparison stayed with him. He dug out an old photograph of his grandfather at a march in Alabama. The black and white image showed him holding a sign with simple words: "We shall overcome." Marcus stared at it for a long time, feeling as if history itself was looking back at him. By August, Marcus's essays were being shared more widely. He wrote about the silent kneeling moment, about the feeling of unity in the crowd, about the fragile line between chaos and peace. An online magazine published one of his pieces, and the editor emailed him afterward, encouraging him to keep writing. One sentence in particular seemed to resonate with readers: "We are not only marching for justice, we are marching for the right to breathe without fear." People quoted that line on social media, some painting it onto signs for later protests. Marcus was startled the first time he saw someone holding his words on cardboard, but it also gave him a quiet pride. His thoughts, his voice, were echoing beyond the pages of his notebook. One late August evening, Marcus stood again near the Lincoln Memorial, this time not as part of spontaneous protest, but an organized vigil. Hundreds of candles flickered along the steps, their light reflected in the water of the reflecting pool. The air smelled faintly of wax and summer flowers, and the crowd hummed with subdued energy. Speakers took turns addressing the people, their voices carried by microphones, but it was the moments of silence that struck Marcus most. He held his candle close, the flame trembling in the breeze, and thought about how far he had come in just 2 months. He remembered the hesitation of that first day, the fear in his chest when he had seen the police line. He thought of the strangers who had become friends, of the workshops at the community center, of the teenager who had thanked him for teaching her what the school never had. He thought of his grandfather, of his mother's worried but proud voice. And he realized that the protest in June had not just changed his life, it had redirected it entirely. Still, he knew the journey ahead would not be easy. Already he had lost touch with some old friends who didn't understand his commitment, who told him he was wasting his time. At family gatherings, a few relatives warned him that activism would lead nowhere, that it was dangerous, that he should focus on getting a real job. Their words stung, but Marcus no longer felt hollow when he heard them. He had found something more valuable than stability. He had found purpose. As the autumn approached, he began to think about the future in new ways. He wondered if he could pursue teaching, maybe even return for a master's degree in history or political science. He wondered if he could keep writing, perhaps publish a book someday. More than anything, he wondered how long the fire inside him would last, and what he needed to do to keep it alive. On a cool September morning, Marcus walked past the U.S. Capitol building, notebook in hand, as another small march began. The air was crisp, the sky pale blue. He stopped for a moment, watching the group gather, signs rising once again into the air. He smiled faintly, adjusted the strap of his backpack, and stepped forward to join them. For Marcus, there was no turning back. The protest in June had been the spark, but now he carried the flame. Marcus adjusted the strap of his backpack and stepped into the flow of the march. The sound of footsteps against the pavement mixed with the rhythmic call of voices that rose together, echoing across the wide streets of Washington, D.C. compared to the massive protest he had joined in June. This gathering was smaller, perhaps 200 people, but the energy was no less potent. It reminded him of the way rivers, even when narrow, could carve deep paths into the earth over time. As the group moved forward, Marcus found himself walking next to a young woman named Evelyn. She introduced herself quickly, her voice breathless as she shouted between chants. Evelyn was a law student at Georgetown, and she explained she had been volunteering to provide legal aid for arrested protesters. "Sometimes it feels like a losing battle," she admitted, brushing sweat from her forehead. "But then I see people keep showing up like you, and I remember why it matters." Marcus nodded, feeling a strange sense of recognition. He had been searching for meaning for so long, and now it seemed to find him in every conversation. They exchanged numbers before the march ended, promising to meet again at a community forum the following week. That night, back at his apartment, Marcus opened his notebook again. The pages were filling quickly these days. Scribbled observations, fragments of overheard chants, reflections on history. He began writing about the smaller protests, about how they carried just as much importance as the larger demonstrations. "Change does not always roar," he wrote. "Sometimes it whispers, steady and relentless, until walls that seemed immovable finally crack." The following week, Marcus attended a forum where he met Evelyn again. The meeting was held in the basement of a church in northeast D.C., the air heavy with the scent of old wood and coffee. Dozens of people sat in folding chairs arranged in a circle. Some were veterans of activism, their voices strong with decades of experience, while others were students wide-eyed and eager. Marcus sat quietly at first, listening to discussions about voter registration drives, community safety, and school funding. When his turn came to speak, he hesitated only briefly before saying, "I think part of what we're fighting is silence. Too many stories go untold. If we can teach the history, if we can remind people that what's happening now is connected to what has always happened, then we're not just shouting into the wind. We're building something that lasts." A murmur of agreement rippled through the circle. Evelyn smiled at him, and the meeting moved on, but Marcus felt a new weight settle on his shoulders, a weight that came not from burden, but from responsibility. Over the next months, his life shifted further. He still worked part-time at a bookstore to pay his bills, but increasingly his evenings were filled with meetings, workshops, and writing. He began publishing regular essays online, and to his surprise, some of them went viral. Messages poured in, some from strangers thanking him, others criticizing him sharply. The criticism stung at first, but he learned to sift through it, to hold on to constructive and let the rest slide away. In October, Evelyn invited him to attend a legal aid clinic where volunteers helped families facing eviction. Marcus wasn't a lawyer, but he offered to keep children occupied with reading and drawing while their parents met with attorneys. Sitting on the floor at a crowded community hall, he read picture books to kids whose laughter echoed despite the heavy circumstances. When one boy asked him, "Are we going to have to sleep in the car again?" Marcus felt his throat close. He had no answer, but he promised himself he would not look away from such realities. The weight of it all often left him exhausted. There were nights when he returned home too tired to cook, collapsing on his couch with a half-eaten sandwich. There were mornings when he questioned if he was making any difference at all, but each time doubt pressed on him. He remembered the silence of that June afternoon, the thousands kneeling together. He remembered the trumpet, the candles, the faces of strangers who had become companions. Those memories anchored him, pulling him forward even when the path blurred. As winter settled over D.C., protests became less frequent, but the work behind the scenes grew. Marcus helped organize educational sessions in libraries, sometimes speaking to small groups, other times to packed rooms. His voice grew steadier with each talk. He no longer clutched his notes with trembling hands. Instead, he looked people in the eye, weaving stories of past and present, urging them to see themselves as part of a larger continuum. One night, after a lecture at a community college, an older man approached him. The man's hair was gray, his step slow but steady. He introduced himself as Henry, a retired teacher who had marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in 1963. "You've got the fire, son," Henry said, gripping Marcus's shoulder firmly. "Don't let the world smother it. We need more voices who understand where we came from and where we're going." Marcus carried those words like a shield in the weeks that followed. By the time spring returned in 2021, Marcus's life felt unrecognizable compared to the year before. He had become a fixture at community events. His essays were being reprinted in local newspapers, and his workshops had expanded into partnerships with schools. His mother, once so worried, now spoke of him with pride to relatives, though she still told him to be careful every time they talked. But with growth came challenges. Some of his old friends drifted away, unable to understand why Marcus no longer had time for nights out or casual weekends. "You've changed, man," one of them told him over the phone, the tone edged with bitterness. Marcus wanted to protest, to explain that he hadn't changed so much as found himself, but the words stuck in his throat. After the call ended, he sat quietly for a long time, realizing that purpose often came with sacrifice. In May, Evelyn invited him to speak at a panel discussion at Georgetown University. The auditorium was filled with students, professors, and activists. Marcus sat on the stage, nerves buzzing through him. But when the microphone was placed in his hand, he breathed deeply and began. He spoke of silence and whispers, of history and memory, of the way ordinary people could shape extraordinary change. By the time he finished, the room was quiet. Not because they disagreed, but because his words seemed to linger in the air like smoke. The applause that followed felt overwhelming, and Marcus knew he was stepping into a larger role than he had ever imagined. After the event, Evelyn found him in the hallway. "You should think about grad school," she told him. "Or maybe even running for something someday. You have a gift, Marcus." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "I don't know about politics, but teaching, maybe. Writing, definitely." Still, her words planted a seed. That summer, Marcus returned to the Lincoln Memorial for another vigil. The air was thick with the scent of honeysuckle, and fireflies darted through the dusk. As he held a candle once more, he reflected on the journey from that first protest to this moment. He thought about the countless hours of work, the voices he had met, the children, the teachers, the strangers who had become allies. The memory of June 2020 no longer felt like just a moment in time. It felt like the opening chapter of his life's true story. He closed his eyes, letting the warm night breeze brush against his face, and whispered a promise to himself. The fight was far from over, but he would not step back. He would keep writing, keep teaching, keep showing up, because one protest had changed his life. And through that change, perhaps he could help shape the lives of others. And as the candlelight flickered against the marble of the memorial, Marcus understood that he was no longer simply a man searching for direction. He had become part of a movement, a living thread woven into the fabric of history. It was a humid afternoon in the middle of June 2020, when Marcus Allen, a 27-year-old history graduate from Howard University, found himself standing among thousands of people gathered along Pennsylvania Avenue, just a short walk away from the White House. The air was thick with chants, raised fists, and the sound of drums echoing through the streets. Some carried handmade cardboard signs. Others held candles or simply stood in silence. The crowd swelled with every passing minute, and Marcus felt both small and immense at the same time. He remembered the night before, lying on his bed in his small apartment in southeast D.C., staring at the ceiling, listening to helicopters circling endlessly above the city. His phone buzzed constantly, messages from friends, news updates, live streams. He couldn't sleep, and when dawn finally arrived, he told himself he had to be there, no matter the risk. Now he stood in the middle of history, unfolding. Sweat ran down the side of his face, not only from the heat, but from the tension humming through the streets. Claire, the woman from Baltimore, kept glancing toward the police line, her eyes sharp and restless. Beside them, a group of college students unfurled a banner that stretched nearly 10 feet wide, reading, "We can't breathe." The words shook Marcus's chest like a drumbeat. The speeches began around 2 o'clock. A man with a booming voice climbed onto the stage and spoke of justice, of names that should never have been forgotten, of lives taken too soon. Marcus listened, but more than the words, he felt the emotion radiating from the crowd. People shouted in agreement, clapped their hands, and some simply bowed their heads as if in prayer. At one point, Marcus's eyes drifted toward a row of police officers standing near the barricades. Their faces were hidden behind visors, their hands gripping batons, their posture tense. He wondered what they were thinking, if they felt fear, anger, or guilt. Did they see him as an enemy or as a citizen demanding change? For a moment, he felt an urge to walk toward them, to say something human, but the sheer weight of the moment kept him rooted to the ground. By late afternoon, the sun began to sink lower, painting the buildings with golden light. The chants grew louder, echoing off the marble walls of federal offices that lined the avenue. Marcus joined in, his voice cracking but determined. Each shout felt like it carried not only his own pain, but the pain of his father, his grandfather, and the generations before him. A sudden ripple of noise cut through the crowd. Someone shouted that the police were moving forward. Tension surged instantly. People raised their arms in the air, chanting louder, insisting, "Hands up, don't shoot." Marcus's chest tightened, but he held his ground. Claire gripped his arm, and the two of them stood side by side as officers advanced a few steps before halting again. It was a game of nerves, a test of resolve. For a long stretch of minutes, time seemed suspended. Marcus could hear his own breathing, the rustle of signs being lifted higher, the faint beat of drums in the distance. Then, as if on cue, the crowd began to kneel. One after another, people lowered themselves onto the burning pavement, their knees pressing into the ground, their silence louder than any chant. Marcus knelt too, his palms pressed flat on his thighs, his eyes fixed on the rows of officers. The silence lasted 8 minutes and 46 seconds, the exact length of time George Floyd had been pinned to the ground. Tears slid down Marcus's cheeks, though he hadn't realized he was crying until the salt stung his lips. Around him, sniffles broke through the quiet, the sound of grief shared by thousands at once. When the moment ended, the crowd rose again, voices breaking into chants, songs, and shouts. The unity was overwhelming. Marcus felt lifted, as if carried on a tide of hope, even while danger still loomed close. He realized then that this day was not just a protest. It was a turning point for him, for the city, for the country. As evening approached, the atmosphere shifted once more. Streetlights flickered on, casting pale glows over faces still determined to be heard. Some people lit candles, their small flames dancing against the twilight. Marcus stayed, though his legs ached and his throat was raw. He couldn't bring himself to leave. Something told him he had to see this through, whatever this was becoming. The first sound of sirens broke the rhythm. A line of police vehicles rolled in, lights flashing, engines rumbling low. The crowd tensed again, unsure what would follow. Officers in riot gear formed new lines, Shields up, voices barking commands that few could hear over the noise. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't move back. Instead, he found himself gripping Claire's hand tighter. Suddenly, the crowd surged forward, not to attack, but to hold their ground. Marcus was pushed along, swept by the current of bodies, his senses overwhelmed. The smell of sweat and smoke mixed with a metallic tang of fear. Then came the unmistakable pop of tear gas canisters being fired. White plumes burst into the air, stinging eyes and throats. Chaos erupted. Marcus's vision blurred as the gas clawed at his lungs. People coughed, stumbled, shouted for water. Claire pulled him toward the side street, where volunteers handed out bottles of milk and medical masks. He doubled over, coughing violently, his chest on fire. When he finally managed to breathe again, he looked back at the avenue. The protest still raged, but the once peaceful atmosphere was now fractured, torn between resistance and panic. He wanted to run, to escape, but he couldn't. Something inside him, pride, anger, love for his community, rooted him there. He straightened up, wiped his eyes, and stepped back toward the crowd. Claire looked at him as if to ask whether he was sure. He nodded, and together they rejoined the line of people still standing against the advancing police. Hours passed like minutes. By the time midnight crept over Washington, the crowd had thinned, but many still remained. Marcus's clothes were damp with sweat, his voice nearly gone, his body aching. Yet his spirit was alive in a way he had never known. He realized that no classroom, no book, no lecture could have taught him what he had learned on the streets that day. When he finally returned to his apartment in the early hours of the morning, the city was eerily quiet, though helicopters still hovered above. He collapsed onto his bed without changing his clothes, his body heavy, his mind racing. He knew he wouldn't sleep. Images of the protest replayed in his head. The faces, the chants, the silence, the unity. That night, Marcus understood something vital. He could never go back to who he was before. Marcus lay on his bed with his body still heavy from exhaustion. He hadn't even bothered to change his clothes. The room remained dim, lit only by the glow of a street lamp sneaking through the blinds. Outside, the faint hum of helicopters still drifted in the night air, reminding him of the chants, the drums, the burning sensation in his throat from the tear gas. His eyes closed, but sleep wouldn't come. Each time he drifted, he saw faces again. Claire gripping his hand, a child perched on his father's shoulders, waving a small flag, an elderly man kneeling in prayer, tears cutting lines across his cheeks. Morning came with a dull ache in his limbs, but there was a fire in his chest that felt new. He turned on the television, and every channel replayed images of Washington, D.C., thousands of people flooding the streets, signs raised, fists in the air, moments of silence followed by eruptions of chants. Helicopters filmed from above, capturing what looked like a river of humanity flowing past the White House. For a second, Marcus thought he caught a glimpse of himself in the crowd, a small figure in a sea of determination. He smiled faintly. For the first time in his life, he felt he wasn't just reading history. He was living it. At 10 in the morning, his phone rang. His mother was calling from Atlanta. Her voice was tight with worry. "Marcus, are you all right? I saw the news, baby. It looked dangerous out there. Why did you have to be there?" Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the window at the pale morning light. "I'm okay, Ma. I promise. But I had to be there. If I don't stand up, who will? I can't just sit here and watch anymore." There was silence on the line. He could hear her breathing, could almost feel her hesitation. Finally, she spoke again, softer this time. "You know, your father used to join protests too, back in the 70s. He would come home with bruises, sometimes coughing from the gas. I worried about him just like I worry about you now. Maybe it's in your blood." Her words lingered in Marcus's mind long after the call ended. He remembered stories about his father, marching on campus, writing articles in the student paper, speaking against the war and for civil rights. Now, decades later, Marcus felt like he was carrying a torch that had never truly gone out. The following days blurred together. Every afternoon after finishing his shift at the bookstore, Marcus returned to the streets. Sometimes the gatherings were peaceful, filled with music, chanting, and quiet vigils where people knelt in silence. Other times, the atmosphere snapped tense without warning, lines of riot police moving forward, the sharp crack of tear gas canisters firing, the confusion of people stumbling and coughing as smoke spread through the air. He met more people as the weeks went on. Claire remained a constant presence, always appearing by his side as though fate pushed them together in every crowd. He also became close with Jamal, a law student from Georgetown with a commanding voice. Jamal often stood on portable speakers or benches, delivering speeches to the crowd about constitutional rights, systemic injustice, and a long arc of history. Marcus admired his courage and slowly, almost unknowingly, began to find his own voice. One late afternoon, after a peaceful march that wound its way past the National Mall, Marcus and Claire sat on the curb, sharing a bottle of water while the sky deepened into shades of gold and orange. Claire's voice was thoughtful as she passed the bottle to him. "You know, Marcus, I've been to a lot of protests before, but this one feels different, like the world is finally watching." Marcus stared at the Washington Monument in the distance, its reflection faint in the shallow pools nearby. "I feel the same. I used to read about the civil rights movement in books, about Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks. But being here, this feels like those stories, except it's happening now, and I can't walk away from it." Claire smiled faintly, her eyes tired but glowing. "You're not alone. None of us are. That's the point." Her words echoed in his mind. That night, Marcus began writing in a journal. Each entry detailed what he saw, what he felt, the fragment of conversation, and images that burned into him. He imagined someday reading it back to his children, or even publishing parts of it, so others would understand what it felt like to stand on those streets. Not everyone supported him, though. One evening, a message popped up on his phone from an old college friend named David. "You're wasting your time out there. They'll never listen. You should be looking for a steady job, not shouting in the streets." Marcus read it again and again, anger rising in his chest. He almost typed a long reply, but in the end, he put the phone down. Deep down, he knew silence wasn't an option anymore, not for him. He could never go back to sitting quietly while the world passed by. The tension escalated at the end of June. On a Saturday night, thousands gathered again near the White House. Streets were closed off. Searchlights swept across the crowd, and helicopters circled low. Marcus stood in the front line with Jamal and Claire. The chants were deafening, rolling like thunder through the night air. Suddenly, a command barked through loudspeakers, and the line of riot shields advanced. The crowd shouted louder, pressing forward. The air snapped with energy, the fragile balance tipping into chaos. Marcus felt the shove of bodies all around him. Someone screamed. Gas canisters arced overhead, landing with sharp pops before releasing thick clouds that burned his eyes and clawed at his lungs. He coughed violently, tears streaming down his face, stumbling as panic surged around him. Claire's hand tugged at his arm, but in the confusion, they were separated. He could only see silhouettes through the haze, people running, people falling, police pushing forward with shields raised. In the middle of the smoke, Marcus spotted a young man collapse on the ground, motionless. Without thinking, he dropped to his knees, lifting the man's head, shouting for help. A small group rushed over, one woman pouring water over his face, another dragging a backpack open for supplies. Together, They pulled the unconscious man to a safer corner. Marcus's lungs burned, but he refused to leave until the man coughed and finally opened his eyes. When Marcus stumbled home that night, his clothes reeked of smoke and sweat. His eyes were red, his throat raw. He stood in front of the mirror, barely recognizing himself. Hair disheveled, face streaked with grime. Yet beneath the exhaustion, something in his reflection had changed. He saw resolve, courage he had never known he carried. The protest continued into July, though the crowd sometimes shrank and swelled with the news cycle. Marcus found himself not just participating, but speaking. Jamal encouraged him to share his words, and soon Marcus was leading chants, reading passages from his journal, even writing short opinion pieces that local online outlets began to publish. People started reaching out, thanking him for his words. One evening, in a quiet cafe that stayed open despite the unrest, Marcus and Claire sat across from each other. The cafe was nearly empty. The city outside still tense but calmer than the chaos of the protests. Claire sipped her coffee slowly, her voice soft. "Marcus, I think your life won't ever be the same after this." He nodded, staring at the glowing lights outside, thinking of his father's footsteps, of the boy on his father's shoulders, of the voices still ringing in his ears. "I know. I can't go back to being the person who just watches from the sidelines. I've chosen my path now." And in his heart, Marcus understood the deeper truth. The protests had never been only about the names on the signs or the chants shouted into the night. It was about discovering who he was, unearthing a courage buried deep inside him, and stepping into a future he had never imagined for himself. The streets of Washington, D.C. felt alive that afternoon, though not with the usual rhythm of tourists visiting the Smithsonian or professionals rushing toward Capitol Hill. The city carried a different heartbeat, one that pulsed with chants, banners waving above the crowd, and voices that echoed against the walls of government buildings. Marcus stood in the middle of it, his hands tucked nervously inside his jacket pockets, his eyes constantly moving from face to face. For him, this was not just another protest. This was a crossroads, though he did not fully realize it yet. The air was cool, touched by the last hints of spring, carrying the faint smell of food trucks parked near the National Mall and the sharper scent of permanent markers on cardboard signs. The afternoon sun shone behind patches of cloud, casting soft shadows that shifted over pavement. Marcus tightened the scarf around his neck, not out of cold, but because of the uneasy energy buzzing in his chest. He had never joined a protest before. He had read about them, seen footage online, but standing in the middle of thousands of people chanting for change was something entirely different. He had come to Washington, D.C. for college only 6 months earlier, leaving his hometown in Virginia. The city had always seemed larger than life to him, filled with marble buildings, statues, and symbols of power. Yet today, those very symbols loomed differently. The White House in the distance, the Capitol dome visible at the far end of the mall, the Washington Monument rising high above. All of them seemed to look down silently on the people below, who carried signs demanding justice, equality, and accountability. Marcus's friend Daniel walked beside him, holding a hand-painted sign that read, "Silence is complicity." Daniel's voice was already hoarse from shouting, but he kept going. He was the one who convinced Marcus to come here in the first place. Daniel believed in action, in showing up even when it felt inconvenient or frightening. Marcus admired that, but he was also wary. He worried about police, about violence breaking out, about what his family back home might say if they saw him here on the news. "Don't just stand there." Daniel nudged him, his eyes gleaming with determination. "Raise your voice. You're part of this now." Marcus hesitated. He opened his mouth, tried to join the chant. No justice, no peace. But his voice cracked halfway through, swallowed by the roar of the crowd. Yet even as his own voice faltered, he felt something stir deep inside, like a seed pressing against the soil. He looked around to faces, young and old, black and white, men and women, families with children perched on their shoulders. He saw strangers holding hands, neighbors comforting one another, students climbing onto benches to raise their signs higher. It was not chaos. It was a kind of unity he had never witnessed up close. The march moved slowly along Constitution Avenue, and Marcus walked with it. Every block carried new energy. Drummers beat on plastic buckets, their rhythm spreading to the marchers like a pulse. People with megaphones led chants that echoed against the buildings, bouncing down the wide streets until it sounded as though the entire city was speaking. Journalists weaved through the crowd, cameras raised high, their red lights blinking. Police lined the sidewalks, some relaxed, others watchful, their radios crackling faintly. For Marcus, the atmosphere was overwhelming yet strangely grounding. He began to notice details he had overlooked in his first nervous minutes. The determination in people's eyes, the way some carried water bottles and snacks, ready to share with strangers, the quiet resilience in the older marchers, some leaning on canes but refusing to stop, the mix of fear and courage that sat heavy in the air, like two sides of the same coin. By the time they reached the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the sun had started its slow descent, bathing the crowd in warm golden light. Thousands filled the open space, their voices echoing across a reflecting pool. Marcus looked up at the towering statue of Abraham Lincoln, seated in solemn silence. He wondered what Lincoln would think if he could see this moment, if he would see the unfinished work still left behind in the country he once fought to hold together. A speaker climbed onto the makeshift stage at the base of the memorial. The microphone screeched before the voice steadied. It was a young woman, her voice firm yet trembling with emotion. She spoke about injustice, about lives lost, about the need for change that was more than symbolic. As she spoke, the crowd fell quiet. Even the children stilled, their small faces tilted upward. The city's usual noise, cars, siren chatter, seemed to vanish. All that remained was her voice, carried through the speakers, carried through the people. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He thought of his younger sister, still in high school, who sometimes called him late at night to share her fears about the future. He thought of his mother, who worked 2 jobs to support their family. He thought of his father, silent and withdrawn whenever the news showed another tragedy. And he thought of himself, standing here now, no longer a spectator, but part of something larger. A realization began to take root. Silence would not protect him, and silence would not change the world. Action, however uncertain, was the only way forward. The evening settled in slowly. Streetlights blinked on, casting pools of yellow light over the gathering. Volunteers handed out candles, their flames flickering against the breeze. Thousands of tiny lights stretched across the steps and along the mall, glowing like stars fallen to the ground. Marcus cupped his hands around the small flame, watching it dance, feeling its fragile warmth. When the crowd began to sing, softly, almost like a prayer, he joined in, his voice quiet but steady this time. It was in that moment, surrounded by strangers who felt less like strangers and more like family, that Marcus understood something he would carry with him long after the protest ended. This was not just a day. This was not just a headline. This was a turning point, both for the city and for himself. And though he did not know what awaited him in the weeks ahead, he knew that he would not return to who he was before he set foot on these streets. The night deepened, and the chants began to fade. People slowly dispersed, leaving behind scraps of posters, candle wax, and footprints pressed into the grass. Yet the echo of their voices lingered in the air, a reminder that they had been there, that they had spoken, that they had demanded to be heard. Marcus and Daniel walked quietly back toward the metro, their steps tired but their spirits heavy with thought. Neither of them spoke much, because there was no need. The silence between them was not emptiness, but understanding. As the train rattled beneath the city, Marcus leaned his head against a window, watching the tunnel light streak past. His reflection stared back at him, older somehow, though only a day had passed. He knew he would remember this night. He knew it had already planted something inside him, something that would shape his choices, his friendships, perhaps even his future career. The protest was over for now, but the journey it sparked had only just begun. Marcus did not sleep well that night. Even though his body was exhausted, his mind would not let go of the images from the day. He lay in his small dorm room, staring at the ceiling, hearing echoes of chants that refused to fade into silence. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the thousands of candles flickering at the Lincoln Memorial, their glow reflected in the reflecting pool like constellations. He turned restlessly, the sheets tangled around him, until the city outside finally grew quiet. But inside him, something had shifted, and quiet would not return so easily. When the alarm rang the next morning, Marcus felt a heaviness in his chest. He dragged himself out of bed, pulled on a hoodie, and walked toward the campus cafeteria. The chatter of students around him felt different now, distant. Most of them talked about exams, weekend plans, or the latest sports scores. He found himself tuning out, still replaying the protests in his mind. It was strange to think that just a few miles away, thousands had gathered to demand justice, while here on campus, life moved on as if nothing had happened. Daniel spotted him from across the room and waved him over. His friend's voice was still hoarse, his eyes rimmed with fatigue, but his energy had not dimmed. He leaned forward across the table, lowering his voice. "They're planning another march next week," Daniel said. "Bigger this time. Not just D.C. cities across the country are joining in. We can't miss it." Marcus hesitated, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. A part of him wanted to retreat, to let yesterday remain a powerful memory without committing further. Another part of him, the part that felt alive under the candles and chants, pulled him forward. "I don't know," Marcus admitted. "It was overwhelming. I'm not sure I belong in that space." "You do," Daniel insisted. "Everyone who cares belongs there. That's the point. It's not about being fearless. It's about showing up even when you're scared, especially then." The word sat with Marcus the entire day. In his political science class, while the professor lectured about civic engagement, his mind drifted to the streets filled with voices. During his shift at the library, while reshelving books, he thought of the young woman who had spoken from the steps of the memorial, her voice trembling yet unshaken. And that evening, when he called his mother, her tired voice reminded him of the sacrifices she made so he could study here. He wondered if standing in those crowds, raising his voice, was one small way of honoring her efforts. The days rolled by, each one carrying whispers of the coming march. Flyers appeared on campus bulletin boards. Student groups organized buses. Social media lit up with plans, routes, and safety tips. Marcus felt the momentum growing, and with it, the weight of his own decision. The night before the march, he sat by his dorm window, watching the lights of the city shimmer. The Washington Monument stood tall in the distance, a silent witness to history, both past and present. He thought of the generations before him who had walked these streets, who had raised their voices when silence was easier. He thought of his sister, her anxious calls late at night, and how he wanted her to grow up in a world where she felt safe and valued. When morning came, Marcus pulled on his jacket, slipped a small notebook into his pocket, and walked out to meet Daniel. He did not announce his decision. He simply showed up, and Daniel's approving smile said enough. This march was larger than the first. By the time they reached Pennsylvania Avenue, the streets were already overflowing. The chants rose louder, the drums beat faster, and the air buzzed with urgency. Police barricades lined the intersections, their flashing lights a reminder of the fragile line between peace and chaos. Marcus stayed close to Daniel, but this time he did not keep silent. His voice joined the chants, at first timid, then stronger, until he could feel it vibrating in his chest. As the march wound its way past government buildings, Marcus noticed how different he felt compared to last time. The fear was still there, but it was quieter, drowned out by the collective courage surrounding him. He noticed the determination in the eyes of people pushing strollers, the resilience of elderly marchers walking slowly but firmly, the creativity of signs painted with both anger and hope. He realized this was not just about policy or laws. It was about humanity, about refusing to look away when injustice stood in plain sight. Hours later, the crowd gathered near the Capitol, filling the open spaces with chants that rolled like thunder. A series of speakers took the stage, each telling stories that cut through the noise of daily life and revealed raw truths. Families who had lost loved ones, activists who had spent years fighting, students who were discovering their voices for the first time. Marcus scribbled in his notebook as he listened, fragments of sentences, flashes of emotion. He was not sure why he wrote, only that he needed to, perhaps to remember, perhaps to make sense of it, perhaps because he knew these words would matter later, even if only to himself. As the afternoon stretched into evening, tensions began to rise. A line of police shifted closer, their presence heavier now. Some marchers grew nervous, their chants faltering. Daniel reached for Marcus's arm. "Stay calm," Daniel whispered. "Remember why we're here." Marcus nodded, though his pulse raced. He saw a small clash erupt at the edge of the crowd, shouts rising, a bottle thrown. The air thickened with uncertainty. Yet before the unrest could spread, organizers lifted megaphones and reminded the crowd of their purpose. Slowly, the chants returned, steady and grounding, pulling people back from the edge of chaos. Marcus felt relief flood through him. He understood now how fragile peace could be, how quickly fear could undo hours of unity. The march ended as the sky turned deep blue, the Capitol glowing under floodlights. The crowd began to disperse, but Marcus lingered, staring at the dome. He thought of how small he felt compared to the weight of history, and yet how powerful it was to stand with others and refuse to be silent. That night, back in his dorm, Marcus opened his notebook again. The pages were messy, filled with half-finished sentences, sketches of signs, fragments of chants. Yet as he read them, he realized they told a story not just of the protest, but of himself. A young man who arrived unsure, who stood among thousands, who found his voice slowly, almost reluctantly, but found it nonetheless. He did not know where this path would lead. Perhaps toward activism, perhaps toward writing, perhaps toward simply being a better citizen. But he knew he could not go back to who he was before. The protests had changed him, not in a dramatic, overnight transformation, but in a quieter, deeper way, like a river carving its path through stone. The experience had left a mark that would not fade. And as Marcus placed a notebook beside his bed, he whispered a silent promise to himself. To keep showing up, to keep speaking, to keep listening. Because change, he realized, did not come from one march, one speech, or one day. It came from the slow, persistent courage of people who refused to give up, even when the world told them to stay silent. The following week, campus life returned to its ordinary rhythm, but Marcus found himself drifting further from it. He attended classes, turned in assignments, and met his responsibilities, yet everything felt muted. He noticed the disconnect more sharply than before. When his classmates debated trivial things, whether the dining hall pizza was edible, which professor was easiest for exams, Marcus struggled to engage. His mind kept wandering back to the protests, to the sound of chants echoing down Pennsylvania Avenue, to the way thousands of strangers had carried the same cause together. In quiet moments, he replayed the sight of candles reflecting in the water, the hoarse voices of speakers, The tremor of fear when the crowd nearly tipped into chaos. These were not things he could easily explain to others who had not been there. And so, slowly, he stopped trying. Instead, Marcus turned to his notebook. At first, it was fragments, quotes he remembered, impressions of the atmosphere, feelings he struggled to articulate. Over time, the fragments became longer passages. He described a scent of sweat and street food mingling in the air, the sight of elderly marchers leaning heavily on canes, but refusing to leave, the warmth of Daniel's hand steadying his shoulder when the crowd surged too tightly. He wrote late at night when the city grew quiet, his desk lamp the only light in his room. The words did not always make sense, but the act of writing grounded him, like setting stones into place along an unsteady path. One evening, as he sat scribbling in his notebook, his phone buzzed with a call from his mother. Her voice carried the familiar exhaustion of long shifts and constant worry. Yet there was a softness, too. "I saw the news," she said gently. "Were you there again?" Marcus hesitated, staring at the page in front of him. "Yes, Mom. I was." A pause stretched across the line. He imagined her sitting at the kitchen table back home, the small lamp casting a glow over her tired face. "I just want you safe," she said at last. "You know that, right?" "I know," Marcus replied, his chest tightening. "But I think being there matters. I can't explain it fully, but it feels like something I need to do." Her sigh carried both worry and pride, two emotions tangled together. "You've always had a good heart, Marcus. Just don't lose yourself in it." After the call ended, Marcus sat staring at the silent phone, her words echoing. Don't lose yourself in it. He wondered what that meant. Was he losing himself, or was he finding something that had always been hidden? In the weeks that followed, Marcus began to notice changes within himself. In his classes, he no longer sat passively. He raised his hand, asked questions about policy and history that tied directly to what he had witnessed on the streets. In conversations with friends, he spoke more openly about injustice, sometimes clashing with those who preferred to avoid such topics. Even in the library where he worked part-time, he found himself lingering over shelves filled with books on civil rights, history, and activism. Daniel remained his closest companion in this new chapter. They attended organizing meetings together, small gatherings in church basements and student union rooms where plans were discussed, roles assigned, strategies debated. Marcus often stayed quiet, listening more than speaking, but his presence mattered. Slowly, he began offering ideas, suggestions for outreach, for safety, for documenting stories. To his surprise, others listened. One evening, after a long meeting, Daniel turned to him as they walked across campus. The night was cool, the grass damp with dew, the lamplight casting soft halos around them. "You've changed," Daniel said, not unkindly. "Changed how?" Marcus asked, shoving his hands into his pockets. "You're not the same guy who showed up at the first protest, afraid to chant. You're more certain now, like you've found your place." Marcus considered this, the crunch of gravel under their shoes filling the silence. Maybe I'm just realizing that silence was never really an option. Daniel smiled faintly. "That's the same thing." Marcus carried that thought with him for days. Still, the journey was not simple. With each protest, each meeting, each late-night discussion, he felt the weight of responsibility pressing heavier. He read about arrests in other cities, about marches turning violent, about activists targeted for their work. Fear lingered, always at the edge of his resolve. Yet it was precisely that fear which reminded him the work mattered. One Saturday, Marcus traveled back to his hometown for the first time since joining the protests. The small Virginia town felt quieter than the city, its streets lined with familiar stores and worn houses. At dinner, his father remained mostly silent, as always, but his sister's wide eyes followed Marcus with curiosity. "Is it true you were on TV?" she asked eagerly. "My friend said they saw you in the background of a clip." Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe. I wasn't paying attention to cameras." His sister leaned forward, her face glowing with excitement. "I want to go too someday. When I'm older." Their mother's fork clattered softly against her plate. "No," she said firmly. "It's too dangerous." But Marcus caught the look in his sister's eyes. Hope, determination, maybe even admiration. He realized, with a mix of pride and fear, that his choices were not only shaping his own path, but also influencing hers. Back at school, he threw himself deeper into writing. What began as private notes grew into essays he shared with classmates, then articles submitted to student newspaper. His words were raw, imperfect, but honest. To his surprise, people responded. Some stopped him on campus to thank him. Others emailed to argue, but all of it reminded him that his voice carried weight. The turning point came when a professor, impressed by one of his essays, pulled him aside after class. "You have a talent for capturing the human side of these events," she said. "Have you considered pursuing journalism or maybe policy work?" Marcus blinked, caught off guard. He had never thought beyond the immediacy of the marches, never considered how this new fire inside him might shape his future. "I don't know," he admitted. "I just write what I feel." "That's where it starts," the professor replied with a knowing smile. "But feelings can move people. Don't underestimate that." Marcus walked out of the classroom that day with a strange mix of fear and excitement. For the first time, he began to see his path not as a blur of uncertainty, but as something forming slowly, like a photograph developing in a darkroom. The protests did not stop. They continued, sometimes swelling, sometimes shrinking, but always returning like waves. Marcus was there for many of them, sometimes in the front, sometimes in the crowd, sometimes simply documenting from the side. Each time, he felt that same nervous energy, but now it was tempered with purpose. There were nights when doubt returned, when he questioned whether any of it mattered, whether real change could ever come. But then he would open his notebook, flip through the pages filled with messy handwriting, and remember. He would remember the candles, the chants, the faces of strangers standing shoulder to shoulder. And he would remind himself that change was not about one day or one protest. It was about persistence, about refusing to let silence settle back in. And so Marcus continued, a young man from Virginia who came to Washington, D.C. uncertain and quiet, who found his voice among thousands, and who now carried it forward, not perfectly, not without fear, but with determination. His life had been changed, not by a single protest alone, but by the journey it began. And though he could not yet see the full path ahead, he knew one thing with certainty. He would keep walking it. Weeks stretched into months, and the rhythm of Marcus's life changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. The protest had become a thread woven into his identity, something that shaped not only his weekends or evenings, but the way he viewed his entire future. His days were no longer just about lectures, exams, and late-night study sessions. They carried the weight of questions larger than himself. What was his role in the world? How could he use his education, his voice, his presence, to create change that lasted beyond a single march? On campus, Marcus grew into someone others began to recognize. Students who once passed him without notice now nodded when they saw him. A few stopped to ask about the next march. Others wanted advice on how to get involved safely. Even professors began to take interest, weaving him into discussions about civic engagement, sometimes calling on him to share his perspective. It felt strange being seen this way. Marcus had always been more comfortable in the background, but now he felt the weight of expectation pressing on his shoulders. The pressure grew heavier one afternoon in early autumn. A student organization invited Marcus to speak at a panel about activism. His first instinct was to decline. He was no leader, he told himself, no expert. He had only attended a handful of protests, taken notes, and written about his experiences. But Daniel pushed him to accept. They don't need you to be perfect, Daniel said as they walked across campus, fallen leaves crunching underfoot. They just need you to be real. You've got that. People listen when you talk. Marcus, trust it. When the day arrived, Marcus sat nervously on the stage beside other panelists, a seasoned activist, a professor of history, and a local community organizer. His palms sweated, and his heart pounded as the moderator introduced them. When it was his turn to speak, he almost stumbled over his words. But then he looked at the faces in the audience, students leaning forward, waiting to hear him, and something inside him steadied. He spoke not with polished rhetoric, but with honesty. He described his first protest, how fear had gripped him, how he had hesitated to raise his voice. He told them about the candles at the Lincoln Memorial, about the trembling voice of the young woman who had spoken that night, about how those moments had planted something inside him. He admitted his doubts, his fear of violence, his uncertainty about whether anything would change. And yet, he told them, showing up had changed him, and that alone made it worth it. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment before the applause came. It was not thunderous, but it was steady, warm. Marcus sat down, his chest rising and falling, as if he had just crossed a finish line. For the first time, he realized that perhaps his story, his small, uncertain journey, mattered to others too. That evening, walking back across campus under the cool glow of streetlights, Marcus thought about his professor's earlier suggestion: journalism, policy, writing. Until now, those had been vague possibilities, ideas floating without shape. But after the panel, they began to take form. Maybe his path was not only to march, but also to tell the stories of those who marched beside him. Maybe his words could carry the voices of those who could not always speak. His notebook became his companion. He carried it everywhere, filling it with sketches of moments, overheard phrases, and questions he could not shake. In the dining hall, he wrote about the contrast between the noisy chatter of students and the solemn chants of the streets. On the metro, he described the quiet determination of strangers clutching protest signs. Late at night, he wrote about his own fears, of failure, of irrelevance, of letting people down. One Saturday morning, Daniel found him sitting on the steps of the student union, scribbling furiously. "You're always writing these days," Daniel said, dropping beside him. "What's it all for?" Marcus paused, tapping his pen against the page. "I don't know yet, but it feels like if I don't write it down, it'll all disappear. And it can't disappear. Not now." Daniel smiled knowingly. "Then don't stop." The semester moved forward, but Marcus's attention stretched beyond campus. He started attending city council meetings, sometimes sitting quietly in the back, other times speaking during the open comment periods. His voice shook the first time, but he forced himself through it. Afterward, an older man with gray hair and tired eyes approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Keep speaking," the man said softly. "We need young voices in these rooms." Encouragement like that stayed with Marcus, strengthening him when doubts crept back in. His family, however, remained cautious. During Thanksgiving break, as he sat around the small dining table with his parents and sister, the subject surfaced again. "You're getting too involved," his father said quietly, his fork pushing food across his plate. "This kind of thing, it can get you hurt." Marcus swallowed hard, choosing his words carefully. "I know the risks, but I also know what it means to stay silent. I don't want to look back and wonder if I could have done something." His father's eyes flickered with something unspoken. Fear, pride, perhaps both, but he said no more. His sister, however, grinned at him across the table. "I still think it's amazing," she whispered when their parents weren't listening. Marcus smiled faintly. For her, if for no one else, he would keep going. Winter descended on Washington with its sharp winds and gray skies. Protests grew fewer in the biting cold, but meetings and organizing sessions continued indoors. Marcus found himself drawn deeper, helping plan routes, contacting volunteers, drafting statements. His role was still small, but it mattered. And slowly, he began to realize that change was not only in the streets, but also in the quiet, persistent work behind them. One evening, as snow began to fall, Marcus sat alone in his dorm room, reading over his latest article draft. It was about the fragility of peace during protests, about how easily fear could unravel unity, and how crucial it was to hold fast to purpose. He hesitated before sending it to the student newspaper, his finger hovering over the keyboard. But then he remembered the candles, the chants, the voices, and pressed send. The article was published 2 days later. To his surprise, it spread quickly across campus, shared by students, and even picked up by a local blog. Messages trickled into his inbox, some supportive, some critical, but all proof that his words had reached people. Marcus read each one carefully, his heart pounding. For the first time, he saw clearly. His voice was not only his own, it could carry others too. That realization did not erase his fears, but it gave them purpose. And as the year turned, Marcus stood at the edge of something new. He was no longer just a student drifting quietly through Washington, no longer a boy afraid to chant. He was becoming someone else, still uncertain, still learning, but undeniably changed. And though he could not see the full shape of his path, he knew this. He would keep walking, keep writing, keep raising his voice. Because silence, once comfortable, now felt impossible. The days after the protest carried a kind of echo that Marcus couldn't escape. Every morning when he woke up, the images returned to him as if they were etched behind his eyelids. The heat rising from the pavement, the chants rolling like thunder through the streets, the faces of strangers who suddenly felt like family. He couldn't walk through his neighborhood in southeast D.C. without hearing fragments of slogans in his head or catching himself repeating the rhythm of the chants under his breath. At night, the city seemed quieter, but not in a comforting way. There was an unease hanging in the air. Helicopters sometimes circled overhead, their blades chopping through the stillness. Police sirens flared in the distance, bouncing between the narrow rows of brick houses and empty parking lots. Marcus sat on his porch some evenings, watching the shadows stretch across the sidewalk, and wondered if change was truly coming or if the city would soon return to silence, burying all the voices he had heard that day. A week later, Marcus returned downtown. This time he didn't go alone. He brought his younger cousin, Jamal, who was just 19 and uncertain about joining. Jamal had been nervous, scrolling through endless feeds of confrontations online, but Marcus insisted he come and see it for himself. They arrived in the late afternoon, when the sunlight had begun to soften into gold. The crowd wasn't as massive as before, but the energy was still there. A group of college students marched together, holding a banner with painted fists in black and red. A woman with a megaphone shouted into the air. Her voice carried far down the street. Some people knelt silently on the warm concrete, holding signs with names written across them. Marcus noticed Jamal's eyes widen as he took everything in. The younger man didn't speak for several minutes, just followed closely, scanning the signs and listening to the chants. Finally, Jamal whispered, almost to himself, "It feels bigger than us." Marcus nodded. That's exactly the point. They moved through the crowd together, and Marcus explained the things he had seen last week, pointing to the corner near the National Archives where speakers had raised their voices, and to Lafayette Square where the police line had once blocked their path. He wanted Jamal to see the weight of the moment, not as something distant, but as something personal, something that might one day shift the direction of his own life. As the evening settled in, the mood grew heavier. More officers appeared at the edges of the crowd. The chants grew louder in response, as if the people sensed a shift and refused to let the silence swallow them. A small group of young men began drumming on overturned buckets, keeping the rhythm steady, defiant. The sound bounced between buildings and lifted into the dusky air. Marcus felt a mix of fear and strength. The police presence reminded him of the danger, yet the solidarity of the crowd filled him with determination. He knew Jamal felt it too. The younger man no longer walked hesitantly. He raised his fist when the chants called for it, his voice blending into the chorus. By the time they returned home that night, something had changed between them. Jamal spoke more openly about things he kept quiet before. The way he felt when stopped by officers in his own neighborhood, the unease he carried whenever he walked into certain stores, the way teachers in high school had treated him differently than others. Marcus listened, realizing that the protest had opened the door for conversations long overdue. Over the following weeks, Marcus became more deeply involved. He attended community meetings, helped organize smaller neighborhood gatherings, and began writing articles for an online platform run by local activists. His words, once private scribbles in journals, were now read by strangers across the city. He received messages from people thanking him for expressing what they couldn't put into words themselves. Still, not everyone was supportive. His father worried about him being arrested or injured during the marches. Some old friends rolled their eyes, claiming protest didn't change anything, that life would keep moving the same way it always had. Marcus didn't have all the answers, but he couldn't shake the feeling that silence was no longer an option. One evening in late July, a vigil was held at Freedom Plaza. The setting sun painted the buildings in shades of pink and orange, and hundreds of candles flickered across the open space. People gathered in circles, reading aloud the names of those who had lost their lives. Marcus stood in the crowd, holding a small candle, the wax dripping slowly onto his fingers. The air was heavy with grief, but also with hope, as if the city itself was pausing to breathe. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he hesitated. He hadn't planned to say anything, but Claire, the woman he had met at the first protest, pressed him gently toward the microphone. His voice trembled at first, but then he found his rhythm. He spoke of his cousin Jamal, of the conversations they had begun having, of the way silence could weigh on a family, on a community, for generations. He spoke of the fear, but also of the courage that came when people stood together. The crowd listened quietly. Some nodded, some wiped away tears, and when Marcus stepped back, a soft wave of applause moved through the plaza. He had never felt so vulnerable, yet so connected. That night, as he walked home to the quiet streets of D.C., Marcus realized that the protest had indeed changed him. It had pulled him out of silence and given him a voice he hadn't known he carried. The city around him still bore scars, and the struggle was far from over, but within himself, something irreversible had shifted. The days turned into weeks, and the summer stretched on. Marcus kept marching, kept writing, kept showing up, even when the crowds grew smaller and the cameras disappeared. For him, it was no longer about being seen. It was about refusing to return to the silence that once felt safe but suffocating. He didn't yet know where this path would lead, whether into politics, community work, or something else entirely. All he knew was that the streets of Washington had changed him, and that the echoes of that June afternoon would follow him for the rest of his life. As autumn arrived in Washington, the energy of summer protests gave way to quieter forms of resistance. The streets were no longer filled with daily chants, but the work had shifted into community centers, classrooms, and living rooms where conversations were taking place that once seemed impossible. Marcus found himself no longer just a participant, but a voice people turned to. Jamal often joined him at meetings, their bond stronger than ever. His writings reached further, and sometimes strangers on the street stopped him to say, "I read what you wrote. It gave me hope." Each word carried weight, not because Marcus had all the answers, but because he had learned to speak with honesty and courage. One crisp evening in November, Marcus walked past Pennsylvania Avenue again. The sidewalks were calm, the air cool, the trees nearly bare. He stopped for a moment where he had once stood with thousands of others, remembering the heat, the chants, the faces lit by fire and determination. He closed his eyes and felt it all again, the moment that had broken his silence and set him on a new path. Life had not suddenly become easy, and the city was still full of challenges, but Marcus carried with him the certainty that he was part of something larger. The protest had not only changed his life, it had reminded him that change begins when ordinary people refuse to be silent. He smiled faintly, turned his collar against the cold, and kept walking into the night, knowing that his journey was only just beginning.